Hi everyone, let's take a look at game 5. Nepo has the white pieces, Carlsen has black. They played a Ruy Lopez for the third time in the match. And they arrive at the same position where Carlsen castles, reserving the right to push his d-pawn 2 squares, entering the martial attack. And for the third time, Jan denies him the opportunity to play the martial. I'll remind you the martial is what would occur after c3, d5. And it's a pawn gambit. White can take on d5, unleashing his rook. So black's going to lose the e5 pawn, like this. So it's a pawn gambit, but black gets an initiative. He attacks the white king. There are not a lot of pieces over here defending. And white's queenside is undeveloped. All right, so Jan doesn't want to play like that. So he plays an anti-martial move, a4, the same move he played in game 3, and that's an attack on the b5 pawn. If white takes it, black cannot recover because his rook would be hanging. Now, in the last time we saw this position, Carlsen played bishop to b7 to defend his rook, so that if white plays a takes b5, black can recapture. But here Carlsen plays a rare move and tries something different. I suppose he thought that white did get somewhat of an opening advantage in that last game. So he tries rook b8, sidestepping the a file and protecting b5. Jan trades the pawns and gains the a file for his rook, but it doesn't mean too much because all these entry points are covered. There's nothing to attack down the a file, and Carlsen has plans of opening the b file for his own rook anyway. Okay, h3, d6, c3, and now b4, pushing the pawn forward, trying to open the b file for the rook. This does give up control of the c4 square, but Carlsen thinks it's worth it. Okay, d3 is played, supporting the center, opening the dark squared bishop. Carlsen trades the pawns, and we get a very unusual Ruy Lopez where all the a and b pawns are gone. Okay, now Carlsen tries a very interesting move here, d5, which is like a very, very delayed martial attack because it does give white the option of winning the e5 pawn. Jan does not take, but he could have played e takes d5, and after Carlsen recaptures, then again the e5 pawn is hanging. So white could have taken. Okay, but the problem Jan saw with this position is that after bishop e6, black has some initiative here. He has some threats in the position. He's threatening knight takes c3, which would unleash an attack on the bishop and attack the queen at the same time. He's also threatening bishop to f6, skewering the c3 pawn. So white may have to just take the knight on d5 and give black the bishop pair in an open position. And Magnus has had this a couple of times in the match already, the bishop pair for the cost of a pawn, and he seems to do quite well with it. So Jan didn't want to play this position, so he didn't accept this very delayed martial attack. So instead, he plays knight bd2 and allows Carlsen to take the pawns off on e4, and the knight is shielding the queen so that black can't trade queens here. White still wants to press for a win. The pawn structure is symmetrical, but you can make a case that white has the better position here. Black plays bishop d6, and you can compare the pieces. This is white's so-called bad bishop because it's on the same color square as his central pawn, and this is black's bad bishop. Well, white's bad bishop looks a lot better than black's. Black's is very passive, sandwiched between these pawns. This Spanish bishop has a very nice diagonal here. So that's a favorable comparison for Jan. Also, it's nice that Jan has a mobile c-pawn and Magnus's c-pawn is blocked. And this pawn is doing a good job keeping that knight at bay. In fact, that knight has nowhere to go right now, except maybe back. Okay, and Carlsen has, Jan rather has an extra tempo here because he developed his rook to the e file, protecting his pawn. So white might be slightly better in the position. Okay, now the reason Carlsen moved his bishop to d7 is, besides protecting here, he's just opened up a square for this knight. As I said, that knight doesn't have many prospects on this side of the board, so he wants to transfer it over to the king side. Okay, queen c2 is played, h6, knight f1, and both players want to transfer their knights to the g file, which they both do. Now bishop e3, developing the bishop to a good diagonal, and now queen e8. And so Magnus had to decide what to do with his light squared bishop, and he played queen e8 in order to support the bishop coming to e6, so it can challenge the strong Spanish bishop. You may wonder, why didn't he play the queen to e7, getting it off the back rank and connecting the rooks? Well, the reason that's not such a good move is because it allows white to play knight f5, gaining a tempo on the queen, and the queen would actually have to retreat. There's no other move because bishop takes f5 gives white a crushing position after recapturing. The knight on g6 has to go back to the miserable square in the corner. It can't come forward because white would take it and the pawn on e5 is pinned. So after the knight goes into the corner, white just has a crushing position. Okay, so Carlsen didn't put his queen on e7. He didn't want to lose that tempo. So he puts it on e8, and then rook e d1. And in this position, some commentators were pointing out that maybe a better, more aggressive try that Jan could have gone for was to push his c-pawn instead. Trying to gain some space on the queen side, threatened to push it to c5. This may have been Jan's only hope for pressing for an advantage. If black doesn't want to allow the c-pawn to come forward, he would have to push his own c-pawn to block it. But white actually gets the upper hand in this symmetrical position here. He puts his bishop on a4 to a better diagonal with tempo on the queen. And again, that bad bishop is better than Carlsen's bad bishop. If the queen moves over to the d file, then Jan can place a rook on the d file in line with the queen, prompting it to move again. And then Jan can move his knight to e2 and start maneuvering it towards this very nice outpost on d5. And if he puts it on d5 and Carlsen ever decides to take it, then white can get a nice protected passed pawn. So white has a bit of an advantage in this position. The engine on Lichess here assesses it as plus 1.0. So pushing that c-pawn may have been something to go for. I don't know all the ins and outs of this position and whether black would have to push to c5 or not. I don't know if he can allow the pawn to come to c5, but it's something the commentators were discussing. So instead he improves his rook to the d file, the open d file. Then bishop e6 as planned, supported by the queen. Okay, and Jan decides he doesn't want to trade bishops. He attacks the queen, but then Carlsen blocks with the bishop. The players might have repeated here, but Jan still wants to press, so he doesn't. He plays knight d2, and then Carlsen trades the bishops. Now, white probably has to take back with the queen here, or rather, it's not much of an advantage to take with the rook. If white wants to keep the queens on the board, he can try this, but then black has a nice response. White's threatening to improve his knight to c4, supported by his rook, and attack that bishop. It'd be a very good square for that knight, but black has a nice response. He could have played rook b2 in this position. And the point is you're going to decoy the queen from protecting the rook on a4. So this queen has nowhere to go to stay in contact with the rook, so it has to take black's rook, and then the rooks get exchanged. And so now the queen is holding the c4 square from the knight, and black's doing fine. The engine says this is about dead equal right here, for example. So white didn't see anything to go for in that line, so he does allow the queen trade, and Carlsen takes it. And then Carlsen offers an exchange of rooks, so he's just trying to get all the pieces off the board, and a pair of rooks comes off. Carlsen puts his rook on the b file, rook a6, and now white's going to start pressuring the bishop on d6, which is why black plays the knight back to e8 to support that bishop, maybe also to push the pawn forward and get the king toward the center of the board. The white king marches toward the center, knight f8, knight f5, putting more pressure on the bishop, knight e6, knight c4, adding a third attacker to d6 here. So black has to defend. And if we look at this position, black is very passive and white is very active. White has three pieces doing something here, attacking that bishop, and black is merely defending that bishop. And the bishop isn't doing anything on that square. This bishop has good scope. Okay, the problem though is that black really doesn't have many weaknesses in the position to attack, and the pawn structure is completely symmetrical, and black is solid. So even though he's more passive than white, this is probably just a draw with best play. Okay, so white tries f3, and black plays f6. And another difference in the positions here is this color squares the pawns are on. In an ending where you have a single bishop, you want your pawns on the opposite color from your bishop, which Jan has, and Carlsen doesn't. He has the pawns on the same square as his bishop, making his bishop less mobile. But even that advantage isn't really worth anything. The engine says this is all zeros. Okay, g4, king f7, h4, bishop f8. So Carlsen wants to exchange pieces, putting the knight on d6 rather than the bishop, so he can trade off more pieces. King e2, knight d6. Okay, a pair of knights comes off. h5, expanding on the king side. And this is a really nice knight now. This pawn is holding back the g-pawn here. And so that knight is on a great outpost, and it's looking at a lot of things here, but it doesn't have much to do from f5. Bishop f8, rook a5, king e8. Rook d5 offers an exchange of rooks, and black doesn't take it, of course, because if he does, then Jan is pressing for a win here. He's got these c and d pawns that are going to create a passed pawn, something like this, and then white seriously has winning chances. So after rook d5, of course, Magnus evades that, and the players soon go for a repetition draw. So fifth draw in the match. Still an interesting game for somebody like me. I can learn a lot from it. Probably there are a lot of subtleties that I missed, but hopefully you learned something too. Thanks for watching.